Hello YouTube. Tamriel is a place full of exotic creatures, one even weirder than the next, from the green and disgusting voroplasm to the amazing dragon frog. However, in the lore we can find several really cool creatures which have gone extinct one way or the other by now. Many of these creatures we know of came from the Somerset Isles and Valenwood and were driven to extinction by the Elves when they first discovered Tamriel. And those are the creatures I want to talk about today, so let's dive in. So, a little history for you. In the middle of the Mythic era, the Altmer, that's the Altmer with a D instead of a T, they are the progenitor race to all elves that we can find on Tamriel. They fled their homeland of Altmeris due to it being endangered by some mysterious impending doom. Now, the first place they landed on were the Somerset Isles, although it wouldn't take long before they would also hop over onto Valenwood and colonize it. However, these lands that they landed on weren't exactly empty. In fact, they were inhabited by a range of creatures, many of whom were large, dangerous, and not very welcoming to these elves landing on their shores. But the elves didn't really care about the fact that all these creatures didn't want them on their lands, because the elves, under their first Tamrielic leader, High Lord Torinon, swore to make the land theirs, which practically meant killing off all those creatures which threatened them. A few such of those creatures which they encountered, like the griffins, ended up surviving until the current day and either get tamed or remain in the wilds in small populations. But not all creatures that the Altmer encountered were as lucky as the griffin to escape extinction, as the Altmer drove many of the creatures that they encountered to extinction by killing all of them and presumably preventing their procreation in order to make the Somerset Isles livable for themselves, and they then tried the same in Valenwood. Now, when it comes to the Somerset Isles, there are three main legendary and mythical creatures which were driven to extinction. Basically, we've got the Gatus, the Iliadi, and the Wellwa. Now, the Wellwa is a particularly interesting case because while they were originally driven to extinction in the Somerset Isles by the Altmer, they were later introduced back into the Somerset ecosystem after some Altmer found an alive population of Wellwas in Hammerfell. You see, the Wellwa are these strange four-eyed beasts. They seem a bit like large rats to me, but they're almost bigger than horses, and they have a very bad temperament. They hunt in packs, and with their sharp teeth and quick movement, they make for a real threat to most mortals. Now, the Altmer, which landed on the Somerset Isles in the Meretic era, found the creatures to be hostile and fearsome, seeing them as an existential threat, and thus quickly set themselves to eradicating the entire Somerset population of Wellwas. Now, according to Altmer texts from at the time of those hunts, the Wellwas were among the creatures least welcoming to the High Elves, and they likely raided the Altmer towns in their packs, as the Altmer from time to time wrote down that the Wellwas sought the Altmer's demise, although that could have of course been just justification after the fact, after they basically killed them all off. But of those creatures which in ancient times were seen as the most dangerous, it's actually the only one to have survived. And not because the Altmer didn't try to wipe all the Wellwas out, because they did. But as I said before, some wild Wellwas were actually found in Hammerfell, where they were actually being domesticated by the local orcs, who even used them as war beasts. Now, from there, 6 breeding pairs were taken by the Altmer sapiarchs, who reintroduced them into the Somerset ecosystem thousands of years after they had originally gone extinct due to the Altmer hunts. So, yeah, maybe you feel like this one didn't really count since it's not extinct, but the other 2 primary ancient enemies of the Altmer on the Somerset Isles are definitely all dead by now. Although, interestingly, those 2 species, the Gatus and the Iliadi, are both on the to-do list of the same guy who brought the Wellwas back, but he hasn't found any survived herds of those, so yeah, it's probably not gonna happen. But still, they are quite interesting, so let's talk about them. Let's start with the Iliadi, which is a type of forest spirit or even fairy, according to some theories online. Like the Wellwas, the Iliadi were creatures with more than just 2 eyes, as they were forest giants whose entire heads were covered by their eyes. Now, these creatures were apparently also aggressive to the Altmer, being named in classic Altmer ballads as working with the Wellwas to try and achieve the Altmer's demise and drive them from the Isles. But unfortunately for the Iliadi, just like with the Wellwas, they were no match for the early Altmer, who brought ancient magic from their ancient homeland of Altmeris, which was used to exterminate them in just a few years. Now, the final ancient enemy of the Altmer in the trinity of the most dangerous creatures that they found and exterminated were the Gatus. Now, These gators are a bit of a mystery, because I don't really understand how they lost to the Altmer ancient magic. I mean, it's not too clear to me. You see, while the Wellwa were beasts and the Iliadi were many-eyed tree giants, speculated to be a type of fairy, so they definitely had some magical properties, the gators is just straight up described as a godlike fairy being with, according to legend, godlike powers. And because of that, I personally kinda doubt that they even existed in the way that they are described, or were just adapted into Altmer legend in a more grand way to make their victory over these creatures seem more epic. But yeah, we don't really know. What we do know is that on ancient Altmer tapestries, the gators are described as a type of godlike fairy, which takes the shape of a single man or multiple men, which are created from the earth itself. This man, or group of men, is then surrounded by minor fairies, which all do its bidding. Now, considering these creatures are extinct, I wouldn't really be surprised if the Gators was just one of these Earthmen, and the rest of these Earthmen were just minor spirits, hence why in some cases they are described as one, and in some cases they are described as a group of men, which forms the one creature. But we just know very, very little about them, unfortunately, so that part is also just speculation. Now, with the Iliadi being the speculated forest spirit fairies and the Gators more or less confirmed to be a type of fairy, I made a video on fairies and fairy types in general in the Elder Scrolls lore. It's in the description if you want to learn more about fairies. But those three, the Wellwas, the Iliadi and the Gators, were all driven to extinction on the Somerset Isles by the early Altmer in their quest to make the Isles theirs. Now, some of the most ancient tapestries in the Crystal Tower show the Altmer battles against these three type of creatures, which apparently work together sometimes to bring the Altmer to their knees. Now, these battles are very glorified in tapestries and no doubt exaggerated a bit, but there has to be some truth to them. But when it comes to the Iliadi and the Gators, we don't really know what's real and what's exaggeration, since they have both been extinct on Tamriel for thousands of years. But before we move on to the extinct creatures of Valenwood, I have to say that there were two other creatures which the Altmer either drove off the Somerset Isles and still live nowadays, or drove to extinction. Now, the other creature that they made extinct was actually a bit smaller of stature. It's a bee, or a bee type, the Isgareth bee. Now, this type of bee used to be quite common in the Somerset Isles, but due to the belief that their honey grants immortality, which was really just a legend, it seems that their hives were all destroyed by greedy Altmer, until by the First Era, all of them were extinct. Now, some conspiracy theorists on Tamriel believe that some royalty still have these bees in their private gardens, but we don't have any proof for that. That being said, the legendary three enemies of the Altmer who they drove to extinction weren't the only creatures that they encountered on the Somerset Isles which were not very happy with their arrival. They are just the three which went extinct that we know about, and of course the bees. We know, like I said, that the Griffins, for example, also weren't very happy with the Altmer, and neither were the Sload, who actually lived on the Somerset Isles before the Altmer came to them. Now, the Sload, which are actually intelligent beings, actually had a pretty cool civilization going on the Somerset Isles, but the Altmer weren't too keen on sharing their land, and knowing the Sload, they were also not very happy with strangers on their shores, so after some skirmishes, the Sload were all driven off the Isles towards their now Kingdom of Thras. Now, I made videos on both Griffins and the Sload, and I highly recommend checking them out if you want to know more about either of them. They're in the description of the video if you want to know more. Alright, let's now talk about Valenwood. Now, just like on the Somerset Isles, the Altmer, when they landed in Valenwood, immediately started blasting. While the jungles proved harder to exterminate species in, as many of their ancient predators still lived, they did manage to get rid of a few. Most notably the Basilisk, a creature that we see in many types of fantasy, but which also exists in the Elder Scrolls lore, but it's just extinct due to the doing of the Elves. Now, the portrayal of basilisks, from what we know, is pretty conventional in the Elder Scrolls universe, because it's a snake with magical powers and whose body parts have magical properties, and likely, just like in any other type of fantasy, looking them in the eyes would have caused for paralysis in the person who looked the basilisk in the eyes. But that's just honestly speculation, as their eyes cooked up in a potion can be used to cure paralysis, so I'd say it's likely that, their eyes have something to do with paralysis, so most likely looking them in the eyes would have had the inverse effect and paralyze you, especially since that's a whole thing with basilisks in other types of media. That said, basilisk body parts, while rare, extremely rare even since they've been extinct for so long, are still sometimes seen on the black market and in private collections of alchemists and other craftsmen, because their eyes are very potent alchemist ingredients and their blood can temper weapons, and powdered body parts can actually give a poisonous explosion. So while the creatures extinct, their body parts which survived from the time when they were still alive are still somewhat in circulation on Tamriel, although they are very rare and fetch a really good price. That being said, of most of the creatures which the elves drew to extinction in Valenwood we know relatively little other than their names. For example, we know of Odawaks, which we don't know anything of other than that they are now extinct in Valenwood and that they had really big fangs. Now, we also know that in Valenwood there used to live hippogriffs, who were likely related to the griffins in some way, but they were driven to extinction. Hydra existed, which were multi-headed dragon-like creatures, also driven to extinction. Forest giants, likely related to the Iliadi, existed, also driven to extinction. And satyrs existed, which we know nothing of. We don't even know what type of creature they were, only the name from the Pocket Guide to the Empire. And that they were, you may guess, driven to extinction by the early Altmer who landed in Valenwood. But considering that in other types of fantasy, these satyrs are essentially fawns or man-beasts who are part goat, part man, I think that's most likely the type of creature that they were before being driven to extinction. Although in the Elder Scrolls Online High Isle expansion we actually have some fawns, so maybe those are the creatures that they meant by the name satyr, and they too may be reintroduced eventually, just like the Wellwas in the Somerset Isles, if someone takes them from High Isle to Valenwood, but there's no real lore on that or any efforts going on to do that. Now, a common trend in these types of creatures is that they are essentially classical fantasy creatures, the kind we don't really see a whole lot of in the Elder Scrolls universe. As usually, they either have a funny twist, like the unicorn being a Daedric minion in the Elder Scrolls universe, or they are completely original creatures, while stuff like hippogriffs, hydras, they don't really seem very Elder Scrolls, so I'm not really surprised that they simply wrote them to be extinct creatures by this point. However, that does lead me to the curious case of the Balrog. You know, that guy who in the Lord of the Rings took Gandalf with him to the depths, and of which Morgoth had a whole army? Yeah, those creatures. They also existed in the Elder Scrolls universe. Specifically, they existed in the Elder Scrolls Arenas lore, as Balrog hide was actually an item. Although we have this image of a pre-release Elder Scrolls Arena monster, which was cut from the final release on the UESP, they speculate that it may have been a Balrog, but I'm not too sure personally. But, you know, whichever you want to believe. Now, since then, the Balrogs haven't been mentioned in the lore, so they are likely just retconned. But since some sources describe Somerset Isles to be overrun with demonic creatures before the Altmer cleaned house, my headcanon will be that they likely lived there, on the Somerset Isles, and were driven to extinction by the Altmer, and that just like with the Basilisk, their body parts are still sometimes found on the black market. But that's just my theory, but I like it. And I don't really see myself ever mentioning that Balrog trivia anywhere else anytime soon, so why not here, right? Anyway, that was basically all I can tell you about the creatures driven to extinction by the Altmer, as they claimed the lands of the Somerset Isles for their own and then hopped over to Valenwood. And I sincerely hope that I was able to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today, and if you learned something new, maybe consider subscribing and returning for the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Now, all that remains me to do is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polar Rasputin, Athena Iodis, Volkure of Argonia, King Chris, Bolt, Scrap of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Rakai, Zarmekal, and Mr. Christmas. As thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.